The war had a sound all its own. The distant rumble of artillery, the sharp crack of gunfire, the silence that followed, heavy and suffocating. In that silence, the world assumed only men carried the weight of defiance. But in the shadows, unseen and underestimated, a different kind of hero moved. Young women, sometimes no older than 16 or 17, slipped through the edges of Nazi-occupied towns, through forests thick with frost and fog, across borders that were heavily patrolled and lethal. They carried no weapons heavier than their courage, no armor, but the layers of deception they wore like second skins. These were the couriers of the resistance, messengers whose every step could mean life or death. They bore folded papers hidden in the seams of their coats, whispered secrets encoded in small, fragile notes, and sometimes even smuggled microfilms sewn into the lining of a hat. Every message they carried was a lifeline for soldiers on the front, for families hiding from persecution, for entire communities whose survival depended on secrecy and speed. And yet the world would barely know their names. Imagine crossing a forest at midnight, knowing the slightest rustle could alert a patrol. Imagine delivering intelligence that could save hundreds, while no one applauds your bravery, no medals are pinned to your chest, no headlines proclaim your heroism. This was the world these young women navigated. They moved like shadows, unseen, unheard, yet indispensable. Their motivations were as varied as their paths, some driven by patriotism, others by the need to protect loved ones, and many simply by the conviction that injustice could not go unchallenged. Each step forward was a defiance, each narrow escape a testament to unyielding determination. These were the invisible heroes of the war, and though history may have largely overlooked them, their courage would ripple through time, shaping the resistance in ways far more profound than the battles anyone could see. And in the stillness of night, when the world slept under the shadow of fear, they moved, swift, silent, and the grip of Nazi occupation tightened with every passing day. Streets once familiar became gaunt corridors of fear, where the wrong word, the wrong glance, could seal a family's fate. Amidst the creeping shadows of control, underground resistance networks began to realize that the flow of information could determine life or death. Messages had to move faster than soldiers, cleverer than spies, and under the radar of relentless patrols. And so they turned to those the world often underestimated. Young women, girls like Lena, a 17-year-old whose family had fled from their village after a night of violent raids. She carried grief and determination in equal measure, learning to mask fear with calm. Or Sophie, whose sharp eyes and quiet resolve made her the perfect candidate to slip unnoticed through checkpoints. These were not the women expected to shape the war, yet they volunteered willingly, driven by duty, by vengeance, and by the desperate need to protect their loved ones. Training was intense, secretive, and relentless. They learned to read maps by moonlight, to recognize enemy patterns, to memorize codes that could not be written down. They practiced disappearing into shadows, switching accents, and adopting identities that would hold under scrutiny. Their lessons extended beyond skill. They were taught endurance, mental fortitude, and the cold calculation necessary when hesitation could cost lives. And yet, every new skill came with the weight of risk. A single mistake could mean capture, torture, or death. Society often doubted them, seeing them as children, as fragile, as unsuitable for such perilous work. But every whispered lesson and every clandestine exercise hardened their resolve. They became ghosts, moving through a world that did not yet believe in their power, carrying the hopes of resistance across enemy lines. Even as the night grew darker and patrols became more vigilant, these girls prepared to step into the unknown. Every heartbeat, every cautious step forward was an act of defiance. They were not just couriers. They were the lifeblood of the resistance, trained to navigate a war waged in shadows, and ready to prove that courage had no age, no gender, and no limits. Night had fallen like a heavy, suffocating curtain over the occupied countryside, blanketing the forests and villages in shadows that felt alive. Lena adjusted the strap of her satchel, feeling the familiar weight of its precious cargo. The fragile, folded papers tucked carefully inside. Each note carried secrets, intelligence, and coded instructions that could save lives or turn the tide for the resistance. Tonight, she wasn't just walking through a forest, she was threading herself through danger with every step, navigating paths that could lead to freedom or to sudden, violent death. The first challenge was the forest itself. It loomed around her like a wall of darkness, branches clawing at her clothing, roots threatening to trip her with each careful step. The wind whispered in the trees, carrying faint echoes of movement, the subtle sounds of creatures that did not care about war, or perhaps warnings, she told herself. She pressed on, relying on the memory of her training, which had taught her to move silently, to become invisible to any eyes that might be watching, to anticipate danger before it materialized. The Nazi patrols were meticulous, moving like shadows themselves along the roads, inspecting vehicles, questioning travelers, scanning the forests for any hint of movement. Lena knew she had to avoid the main paths entirely, to skirt the roads where German soldiers would be at every hour. She had memorized the patrol patterns, the timing of their shifts, and the small landmarks that marked safer routes. Her breath was slow, deliberate, keeping her heartbeat from giving her away. Every step carried weight. Every misstep could be fatal. Hours passed in near silence, punctuated by the occasional distant bark of a guard dog or the muted clatter of boots on gravel. She kept her eyes on the ground, but her mind raced, calculating the next move. She thought of the families depending on the messages she carried, the resistance fighters who had placed their trust in her, the countless lives that hung on the thread of her courage. The forest seemed endless, yet she pressed forward, guided by purpose and the faint glimmer of moonlight breaking through the canopy above. Suddenly, a sound froze her in place. A branch snapped nearby, not under her foot, but somewhere in the undergrowth. Lena held her breath, straining to listen. Footsteps approached, deliberate and slow. A patrol, a search party? The hair on her arms stood on end as fear coursed through her veins. She pressed herself against the trunk of a massive oak, heart pounding in her throat, eyes darting for any hiding spot. The footsteps drew closer, then paused. Lena's mind raced. One wrong move, one soft exhalation could betray her presence. She stayed completely still, letting the shadow of the trees swallow her, praying the patrol's attention would pass. Slowly, the footsteps moved on, fading into the distance, and she exhaled silently, relief washing over her in a trembling wave. The next obstacle came as she neared the border. A small village lay ahead, one of the checkpoints that connected two regions under different levels of German control. Couriers like her had to navigate through these areas without raising suspicion. Disguises, false identities, and quick thinking were their only weapons. Lena had practiced her story over and over, a traveler from a nearby town, seeking shelter for the night, carrying only personal letters for her family. Her accent, her mannerisms, even the way she walked had been honed to perfection. As she approached the village, Lena felt the weight of the watchful eyes on her. German officers patrolled the cobbled streets, and civilians glanced nervously from windows, too scared to help. She clutched her satchel tightly, walking briskly but naturally, making sure her nerves did not betray her. At the checkpoint, a soldier's eyes lingered on her for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Lena smiled softly, keeping her gaze steady, her mind racing for contingencies. She handed over her forged documents, heart hammering, palms slick with sweat. The soldier examined them carefully, frowning, muttering to himself. And then, finally, he waved her through. Relief and adrenaline collided, sending a shiver down her spine. She was still alive. She had made it, but the forest and villages were only part of the challenge. Beyond lay the final leg, crossing an open field before reaching the next resistance cell. It was exposed, risky, and every sound carried the potential for disaster. Lena moved quickly, low to the ground, each footstep calculated. The wind carried a faint whiff of smoke from distant fires, and she realized the front lines were not far away. Every shadow seemed to contain a threat, every whisper of the wind a warning. Yet she pressed on, driven by a resolve stronger than fear. Hours later, with her body aching and her mind exhausted, Lena finally reached a small safe house tucked into the edge of the forest. The door opened, and a resistance member ushered her inside. She handed over the messages, trembling but triumphant. Each paper would now reach its intended recipient, and the intelligence she carried would guide strategies, save lives, and strengthen the network that defied the occupiers. That night, as Lena finally allowed herself to rest, she understood the gravity of what they did. Each mission was more than a delivery. It was a defiance, a statement that oppression could not silence courage. Across Europe, countless young women like her moved through darkness, bearing hope where fear tried to take root. They were invisible to most, underestimated by their enemies, yet indispensable to the resistance. Their bravery, often unrecognized, became the lifeblood of a fight that depended on courage, cunning, and an unwavering will to survive. For every mission completed, the couriers paid a price, sometimes invisible, sometimes devastatingly public. Lena had returned from her first major operation exhilarated and terrified, only to discover that Sophie, her closest companion, had not been so fortunate. Sophie had been captured while carrying intelligence across a neighboring region. The news came in fragments, whispered among resistance members who had risked themselves to convey it. Tortured, interrogated, and ultimately executed, Sophie's fate hit Lena like a physical blow. The exhilaration of success collided with the raw grief of loss, a bitter reminder that every mission carried consequences far beyond the immediate danger. The resistance network mourned quietly, for loud grief could be fatal. Every courier understood that death lurked at the edge of every mission. Some were imprisoned for weeks, enduring interrogations meant to break not only the body but the spirit. Others vanished entirely, leaving families in anguish, communities in despair, and friends like Lena forever haunted by the absence. The young women had signed up for this peril, but the reality of the price often struck like lightning, unexpected and searing. Lena's next missions were undertaken with this heavy knowledge in her heart. Each step was calculated, each decision weighted with the memory of Sophie and others who had been lost. Fear became a constant companion, but it also sharpened her instincts. She knew the patterns of patrols, the quiet routes through forests and fields, the tricks of disguise and misdirection. Yet no amount of preparation could erase the gnawing anxiety that each day could be her last, or that of her fellow couriers. Despite the losses, the network of resistance grew stronger. Each mission that succeeded, each message delivered, each connection maintained was a victory in the quiet war that raged behind enemy lines. Couriers became symbols, figures of unwavering commitment, embodying defiance when the world seemed to have surrendered to fear. Villagers whispered their gratitude in the night. Mothers and fathers clung to the hope carried in secret letters. And fighters on the front lines found renewed courage in knowing that intelligence was moving swiftly and safely, thanks to these invisible messengers. The personal costs, however, remained staggering. Families grieved daughters, sisters, and friends whose courage had drawn the attention of the occupiers. Some couriers carried the burden of guilt alongside their grief. Survivor's guilt, knowing that while some perished, they lived to continue the work. Lena felt it in quiet moments, in the sleepless nights when she imagined what Sophie had endured. And yet, even in grief, a resolve hardened. Each life lost became a reminder of the stakes, a catalyst to move faster, to plan more carefully, and to fight harder. The resistance networks, though scarred by sacrifice, adapted and grew. Young women were trained to replace those who were lost. The knowledge of danger passed down like sacred instruction. Every story of courage, every narrow escape, every tragic loss became part of the collective memory of the movement, fueling the next generation of couriers. Lena understood that their work was not just about survival or immediate victory. It was about legacy, about proving that the human spirit could persist even in the darkest of times. By the end of that year, the cost of courage was etched deeply into every face, every heartbeat, every shadowed step across occupied lands. Yet the couriers moved forward undeterred. The terror imposed by their enemies only underscored the importance of their work. They were not just messengers. They were lifelines, symbols, and in many ways the backbone of resistance. Every sacrifice, every narrow escape, every lost friend reinforced the truth that their bravery mattered. In quiet moments, Lena would recall Sophie's laughter, the trembling hands that had clutched messages tightly, and the unspoken promises they had made to protect one another. The price of courage was high, sometimes unbearable, but it was a price they paid willingly, knowing that their actions rippled through history. They were invisible, yes, but their impact was undeniable. They were the lifeblood of a movement, the silent defiance in a world suffocating under oppression. And their legacy was one of unyielding bravery, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to freedom. The war ended, but the echoes of those years of darkness lingered long after the guns fell silent. Streets that had once been patrolled by soldiers now carried only the hum of rebuilding. But for the young women who had carried messages through forests, villages, and enemy lines, the memories were far from quiet. The victories they had achieved were monumental, yet their faces remained largely invisible. Many couriers returned home, physically unharmed, but forever altered, carrying memories that could never be erased. Lena walked through the streets of her village, now free but hollowed by absence. She passed houses where families had been torn apart, where laughter had been replaced by whispered grief. Names like Sophie's lingered in her mind, haunting reminders of the price that had been paid. These women, many of them so young, had been thrust into the crucible of war and had emerged not only as survivors but as legends in their own right. And yet, outside the confines of their communities, few recognized their heroism. Memorials would later rise in honor of those lost, plaques and statues telling the stories of brave souls whose courage had gone largely unrecognized. Historians documented their efforts, piecing together the movements of networks that had been painstakingly kept secret during the war itself. The couriers' stories began to appear in books, films, and interviews, but even then, the narratives often focused on battles and generals, the men whose names dominated history. The young women who had risked everything remained, for the most part, shadows behind the headlines. And yet, the impact of their work was undeniable. Resistance cells that had been nourished by their intelligence thrived. Countless lives were saved. Operations that could have ended in disaster succeeded because messages moved swiftly and invisibly. Every time a soldier found his position fortified against attack, every time a family avoided deportation, every time a city survived an enemy incursion, the work of the couriers echoed quietly. Unseen but profound, Lena, now in her early 20s, visited one of the resistance safe houses years later, walking through the rooms that had once been filled with whispered plans and hurried messages. The walls held the faint scent of paper, ink, and secrecy. She ran her fingers along a faded map, imagining the countless nights spent memorizing routes, evading patrols, and clutching messages that could have meant life or death. She thought of Sophie, of the friends she had lost, and of the courage that had propelled them forward, step by precarious step. Communities began to honor the women with small, quiet ceremonies. Villagers told stories to children, ensuring that the legacy of bravery would persist. Some couriers became teachers, doctors, and activists, their experiences shaping the way they approached life. Their courage, forged in the fires of war, informed every decision thereafter. They taught the next generation that bravery did not always roar on the battlefield. It often moved silently, strategically, invisibly, and yet with results that could shape history. Yet recognition remained incomplete. Many former couriers lived their post-war years in obscurity, their deeds known only to a handful of survivors and close friends. The idea that young women could influence the course of a war was often met with disbelief or dismissal, a societal oversight that echoed the broader underestimation they had faced during the conflict. This silence became a quiet injustice, a reminder that even extraordinary heroism could be hidden by the world's blind spots. Despite this, the narrative of the Couriers' bravery began to grow, carried on the shoulders of those who remembered. Historians, journalists, and family members pieced together diaries, letters, and testimonies, reconstructing missions that had once been top secret. Each story added depth to a collective memory that had risked being erased entirely. Lena herself contributed, recounting her experiences in painstaking detail, revealing the ingenuity, determination, and humanity that had made survival possible. As she spoke, the next generation listened with wide eyes and reverence. Young girls heard tales of Sophie and countless others who had walked the line between life and death, carrying courage in the folds of their clothing. These stories ignited imaginations and emboldened hearts, a testament to the fact that bravery is timeless, and that acts of defiance, however small or unseen, can resonate across decades. And so, though the Couriers had been shadows during the war, their legacy began to shine in subtle ways, in memorials, in histories, in the quiet knowledge that ordinary people could become extraordinary when faced with oppression. The names of the fallen were remembered in whispers, in writings, and in the reverent retelling of stories, ensuring that their sacrifices were honored even when the world had once turned away. The war had taken much, but it had also forged something enduring, a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the indomitable spirit of those who refused to stand idly by. Lena and countless others like her had crossed borders, navigated danger, and faced death with a resolve that few could comprehend. In the end, it was not medals or recognition that defined them. It was the lives they saved, the resistance they strengthened, and the invisible legacy they left for generations to come. Decades had passed since the war, yet the echoes of those harrowing years refused to fade. Across Europe, cities had rebuilt, borders had shifted, and the memories of occupation were etched into the faces of survivors. But in quiet corners, in the pages of diaries and the fading photographs tucked into drawers, the stories of the female couriers endured. Their courage, once hidden in shadows, now whispered across generations, reaching those who had never known fear yet could still understand its weight. Lena, now a woman in her 50s, walked through a small museum dedicated to wartime resistance. She traced her fingers along the display cases that contained letters, maps, and photographs of couriers whose names she knew intimately. Some were friends she had lost. Sophie, Miriam, Katerina, young women whose lives had been stolen by the very forces they defied. Each artifact told a story of bravery, of intelligence carried in secrecy, of nights spent moving through forests and towns where a single misstep could mean death. Lena felt their presence in the quietest corners of the room, as if the walls themselves remembered. Across the globe, historians and writers began piecing together the hidden network of female couriers. Documentaries were produced, books published, interviews recorded with surviving members. The world, slowly but surely, started to recognize that the success of the resistance often rested not on generals or soldiers, but on the courage of those who could move unseen. Children learned of women who had saved families, thwarted enemy plans, and carried messages that shaped battles. Their stories became lessons in bravery, resilience, and the profound impact of ordinary individuals in extraordinary circumstances. Communities began to celebrate these women in ways that were both solemn and uplifting. Memorials were erected, streets named in honor of the couriers, and annual ceremonies commemorated the lives lost and the sacrifices made. Survivors like Lena attended, speaking softly yet firmly to the gathered crowd. They were young, she would say, sometimes no older than you are now, yet they carried more courage than anyone could imagine. Their deeds were not for recognition, but for the survival of others. Remember them, honor them, and let their bravery guide you. The younger generation, inspired by these stories, found courage in unexpected places. Activists, teachers, and volunteers drew strength from the legacy of the Couriers, understanding that resistance is not only fought with weapons, but also with courage, intelligence, and the willingness to act despite fear. Students studied the intricate networks of the resistance, marveling at how these young women had memorized paths, codes, and the identities of countless operatives, all while maintaining the appearance of ordinary lives. Yet for Lena, and many like her, the memory was bittersweet. She often reflected on the faces she had loved and lost, the friends who had disappeared forever into the machinery of war. Every story of survival carried with it an unspoken acknowledgement of those who had not returned. Still, even in grief, there was pride. Pride in having played a part, in having moved unseen but decisively, in having preserved life and hope against overwhelming odds. The Couriers' influence even reached beyond Europe. Descendants of those they saved carried stories across continents, blending personal gratitude with historical significance. Museums in America, Canada, and Israel included exhibits dedicated to their work. Scholars reference the Couriers in studies of resistance movements, espionage, and the broader human capacity for courage under oppression. Their lives, once hidden in shadows, now illuminated the past and inspired the present. Technology, too, became a medium for remembrance. Virtual exhibits recreated the forests, the villages, and the secret pathways Couriers had used. Viewers could trace the routes, feeling the tension, the danger, and the stakes of every journey. The world could now see, in vivid detail, the magnitude of bravery that had once gone unnoticed. Lena sometimes joined virtual tours, guiding audiences through the forests she had once navigated, recounting moments of fear and triumph alike. Her voice, calm yet charged with emotion, carried stories that no textbook could convey, the small acts of courage that had collectively altered history. In these echoes through time, the Couriers lived on, not as shadows but as guiding lights. Their deeds reminded everyone that heroism is not defined by rank, by medals, or by recognition, but by the willingness to act when the stakes are highest. Each story of survival, each testimony, each memorial became a ripple extending outward, shaping how courage and resistance are understood in generations far removed from the horrors of war. And in quiet moments, Lena would close her eyes and imagine Sophie running through the forest, a folded note clutched tightly in her hands, eyes bright with determination. The thought brought tears, but also solace. Their lives, though marked by danger and sacrifice, had mattered. Every life saved, every network maintained, every message delivered had left an imprint that time could not erase. These women had crossed borders, defied fear, and carried hope where the world had forgotten to look. And through every echo in history, their courage continued to resonate, reminding humanity that even the smallest acts of defiance can echo across the ages. In a world that often overlooked the contributions of women, the story of the Couriers stands as a testament to the power of courage. They were young, unseen, and underestimated, yet their actions shaped the course of history. They carried more than messages. They carried hope, defiance, and life itself across enemy lines. Their bravery reminds us that heroism comes in many forms. It does not always roar on battlefields or appear in history books. Sometimes it moves silently, deliberately, invisibly. It lives in the girl who slips through the forest at night, in the woman who holds her nerve at a checkpoint, in the unseen lifeline connecting hope to survival. Today, when memorials are visited and stories are recounted, the Couriers are no longer invisible. Their courage endures, inspiring generations to act in the face of injustice, to carry forward the flame of resistance, and to recognize that even the smallest acts of bravery can leave a lasting imprint. In remembering them, we honor not just their sacrifices, but the enduring human spirit that refuses to be silenced.